Good morning. Morning, everyone. My name is Kevin Ashworth, and I'm really excited to be here. This mic is awesome, by the way, it's very clear. I was asked maybe a month or two ago, I had the pleasure of meeting with Pastor Jason and asked me, would I be willing to come and talk about anxiety? And I feel like I have some credibility to do that. Not only am I probably my most important criteria to have this conversation, I think, is I am a dad. I have two girls, horrible children. They're at home right now. But I own an anxiety clinic. I specialize in the treatment of anxiety disorders. I've owned the clinic for the last 6-7 years. It is in Portland. It's called NW Anxiety Institute. And we provide outpatient therapy, group therapy. And uniquely, we have something called an intensive outpatient program, which is where we see people, children and adults, so you're all welcome to come to therapy, for 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, for about 6 weeks at a time. So that's pretty unique, very specific to the treatment of anxiety disorders. So what we're going to talk about today is, what is that? What does that actually mean? And how can you be helpful for your kiddos? What else? I'm also an adjunct professor at the University of Portland, where actually right now I'm teaching a course on anxiety. So that's a little bit of my information. We have lots of time today to talk about the stuff that I'd like to talk about, and then we're going to have tons of time for questions. So please think about the things that you would like to ask. Now, understand that what I can't do is I can't provide specific information to your specific kiddo. And I know that would be really helpful for me to do today. It's just not possible, and it's kind of technically unethical. I'm not supposed to do that because they're not a client of mine. But generally, I will take your questions, and I'll say, for kids that struggle with stuff like this is kind of what treatment would look like, or these are the kind of things that we would do. But other than that, let's ask tons of questions, but save those, think about those for the end. I don't have any handouts for you. You'll understand why as we get through the presentation, for a couple of reasons. One, the treatment of anxiety is more about a change in perspective than it is about the 2 or 3 or 4 tips that you would get from a Facebook post or a self-help book or something like that. It really requires a formulation change in how you're looking at anxiety in your kiddos. So I don't have those because typically they're not that helpful, and without understanding your kid, your case, or your anxiety, people just try and apply things that don't really fit their world. However, I do have other handouts, things that you might find helpful, and you can email me or email our clinic, and I can direct you to those resources and things like that if you're looking for some literature or things that might be helpful. So, let's get going here. What does anxiety look like? Next slide, please. Just like this, right? What you'll find me talking about today is I talk about anxiety like it's a separate entity, and this is how I talk about it with your kids, right? Anxiety really is this kind of monster or a bully. It's this other thing that kind of guides you and directs you to make all sorts of decisions that necessarily aren't great for you, but they're great for your anxiety. They're great for keeping you safe based on what your anxiety wants. But how do you know if your kids are suffering with issues related to anxiety? So it looks like this. School refusal. Kids choose not to go to school for all sorts of reasons. Many times, conventional wisdom will tell us that that's probably because they're oppositional, they're kind of irritable. Most of the time, they're afraid. We don't necessarily know what they're afraid of, and that's my job or my team's job to figure that out. But this perspective changes things, because most kids would rather be the kids that don't care or don't wanna than the kids that are afraid. So school refusal just in itself can be a million reasons that children aren't going to school, but I can pretty much nearly guarantee most of the time it's anxiety fueled. Social anxiety, panic disorder, strange rules and rituals that they have in their head about attending school, academic anxiety, so on and so forth. So it's also probably one of the first signs that we see for kids, because they just start saying, I don't feel good, I don't want to go. Or they come up with some other reason not to attend school. What else? Isolation, of course. So none of your kids probably do this, but some kids out there just stay in their rooms and look on YouTube and social media and stuff like this. So this is another huge sign, right? Like, the more the world becomes scary to me, what the behavior looks like is they're just staying home, or they're staying in the house or in their bedroom or under their bed, or the world just gets smaller and smaller. Reassurance seeking. This is a tricky one because parents love this, right? If you can get your kid to actually communicate with you and ask you for things, you feel really good about it. But anxious kids do this all the time. So reassurance looks like multiple questions. Am I going to be okay? Who's going to be there? How do I know? What time are we going to get there? How long is it going to be? Over and over and over and over and over. Because what they're trying to shift is a feeling. So let me explain that a little bit. If I asked you guys, if I said before I started today, I said to Pastor Jace, hey, do I look okay? And he says, oh yeah, you look fine. I said, okay, thank you. All right, that's reassurance seeking. But that's not terribly uncommon. It might be strange for me to ask Pastor Jason that, but I should have checked before I left the house, right? But then if I say to him, I know, but like the jacket, was the jacket okay? Yes, you look fine. I know, but the jeans, right? I'm asking him multiple questions about the same thing. I'm not really asking his opinion about how I look. I'm trying to shift a feeling in me. And no matter what this feeling is, I'm looking for somebody else to kind of manage that. Does that make sense? So your kids can do that in all sorts of ways, because you know this, if you've provided them with a very reasonable answer to a concern, and they're still asking you more questions, then they're not really asking you questions. The content of the question doesn't matter. They're trying to manage their distress. Repeated questioning. Procrastination. Procrastinate, the number one way, the most effective way to manage your anxiety, don't write this down, is avoidance. It's effective. It's not adaptive. But procrastination is a subtle type of avoidance. So every time your kiddo opens his school books or has to get his soccer cleats and they delay, there's lots of reasons kids do this, but often when it's anxiety related, it's because when I sit down to think about a responsibility that I have, I delay it. So when I close that book, that yucky feeling that I have kind of goes away temporarily, and I tell myself, well, I'll just get to it later. So procrastination can definitely be a sign of anxiety. Difficulty falling asleep. Another type of avoidance, one is procrastination, the other one is distraction. I'm not checking my phone, right? It's distraction. We do this all day long. All day long. If you got here 5 minutes early, if you got here 32 seconds early, you probably went, probably something I must get caught up on here real quick, right? We do this all the time. And so what happens when we lay our head down, if you're not allowing your kids to fall asleep to audiobooks and music and YouTube and lights on, is difficulty falling asleep. They can't tolerate the thoughts that come into their heads, or we can't tolerate our thoughts that come into our heads. So going to bed is a really difficult time. Another strategy for that is your kid just requires everything on until they're so exhausted that they just fall asleep. Increase in physical complaints, and this is often for the younger kids, but when kids feel nervous, they usually say, my tummy hurts. I don't feel good. I have a headache. Some of this is because they're literally feeling sick. They don't, like their body is responding physically, which is not unusual. But of course, that gets reinforced because when kids say, I'm kind of nervous to go to school, most parents say, yeah, you'll be okay. Come on, let's get you there. But if kids say, I feel sick, we usually go, oh, shoot. At least I did with my first kid. By the second one, you go, yeah, you're okay. Let's just go to school, right? So that makes sense. Irritability, right? This is also just a trait of being a teenager, but most kids that suffer with depression and anxiety, time out. These are all what we're talking about. This is us. This is all of us. Your children just happen to be smaller versions of you, right? We all live with this stuff. So we're talking about kids today, but this is all of us. Many of us struggle to articulate our emotional expression to people we love and care for. And kids certainly aren't going to do this. So your kid's not going to say, hey, Mom, can I check in? I've just really had some irrational thoughts today and feelings of overwhelmedness while I was at school. They're going to come home and you say, how was your day? And they go, right? And they take out their shoes. Oh, could you put your shoes in the basket? And you're like, wow, irritability, right? Fear drives that irritability because they're spending their day trying to keep everything in, and their anxiety is stripping their capacity to manage their emotions until they get home. And that irritability has been built up for a few days, most likely. So some kids really follow rule-based behaviors or ritual behaviors. Things have to be a certain way. So we have to eat dinner at 5 o'clock, or else I have strange thoughts about what might happen, or I have to put my shoes and socks on a certain way, or wash my hands a certain number of times. So those would be examples that anxiety is probably driving some of those behaviors. Worst case scenario worrying. So these are kids that would be diagnosed likely with something called generalized anxiety disorder, which is excessive worry. But their worry looks like this. It's all what if based, and it has a worst case scenario at the end. What if I don't do well on this paper? If I don't do well on this paper, I'm not going to get an A in the class. If I don't get an A in the class, it's going to impact my GPA. If that impacts my GPA, I'm not going to get into the college I want to get into. If I don't get into the college I want to get into, I'm not going to get the job that I want. I'm not going to marry somebody that's going to love me. My life is going to be over. And you're going, that's like a one-page biology paper. Right? It's that worst, that future-oriented worst-case scenario, and that plays out for them all day long. So it's very overwhelming. Increasing intolerance to physical discomfort. We've kind of talked about that a little bit. Drug use, again, there's lots of ways to cope. I'm not going to today talk about a list of coping skills for your child's anxiety, and I hope when you leave you understand why. Because we cope naturally. We cope by avoidance. We don't have to teach people how to cope. We do the best we can. Unfortunately, sometimes people want to not feel so distressed, and a pretty quick way to do that is to use some kind of substance to alter that mood state. And so if you're noticing your child, your teen, using drugs, one reason might be because they're trying to get rid of a feeling and help sleep and so on and so forth. Shame is a tricky one because if your kid's suffering with feelings of low self-esteem and doubt about themselves, what we notice with these kids is they seem to internalize every concern in their life. So anything that's great, any successes that they experience is probably happenstance and fluke to them. Oh, well, everybody does well. But any failure is always absolutely their fault. And so this is that internal experience of shame, like I'm not good enough. Hopelessness. One of the bigger predictors of suicide is not necessarily depression. It's not necessarily sad mood. And as you can see from here, many kids are behaving all sorts of ways, and it's not textbook like, hey, I'm sad or I'm anxious. But if you wake up every day and you make all of your decisions based on fear, you start to feel pretty hopeless that tomorrow you have to do the same thing, and the next day and the next day. So that really increases risk of suicide and increases the symptom of suicide ideation, which we can talk about more if you'd like. Excessive washing is just an example. If you're noticing that in your kids, that might be fueled by anxiety, fear of germs, or fear of contamination of some sort. Double checking things, double checking the locks, double checking the blinds, the cars, double checking when you're home, excessively texting you, making sure you've got the find your family member feature on your phone. Most parents implement that for knowing where their teenagers are and husbands. And then, but many kids want to utilize that to know where their parents are, which is the ultimate form of reassurance seeking, right? If you have any kind of separation anxiety. So I feel distressed, so I just can check. My mom's still at work, she's safe, or she's on her way home, she's safe. Skin picking happens to be a form of a behavior that happens through anxiety. So if you notice that, pay attention. Something else probably popped up there that I missed it. Hair pulling. I don't suffer with that. Please don't judge. Okay. But ultimately, all of these fall into a big category of avoidance and distraction. And so that is primarily the thing most of us do. Sometimes overtly, we just say, nope, not doing it. Hey, did you know there's a presentation this weekend on anxiety and distress? And somebody goes, oh man, that would be helpful. What if somebody notices me there and they think that I'm there because my kids have problems and I don't want them to notice that my kids have problems? I'm not going, right? Avoidance. Once you make a decision to avoid, your anxiety is mitigated. So that works temporarily and grows that anxiety monster over time, big time. Okay, next slide, please. So what's the difference between stress and anxiety? This is really, really important because sometimes many of your family members are just suffering with or living with stress. And then how do we know if it's something more concerning that perhaps maybe therapy would be helpful for or something else? So don't pay attention to all that. I'll explain what this is. Stress, a definition of stress is really any physical or emotional concern that outstrips your capacity in the moment, right? So what I mean by that is there's a problem that's coming up that is time limited, meaning once this problem's over, I'll feel okay, but it's overwhelming. So an example for children might be a rehearsal, a test, a date, anything that feels stressful and overwhelming. But after that experience, they're not worried about it anymore because the thing that you're worried about is gone, okay? So it's time limited, meaning at some point that stressor is over. It's solvable, meaning you can be helpful, and there's ways that they can cope to mitigate the stress around the issue. So let's think of an example. So if I have an exam coming up and I'm overwhelmed, doesn't matter how successful I am on the exam or not, but on Saturday morning after the Friday exam, the exam's over. I'm not worrying about it anymore. It's done, okay? That makes sense? That's really important. One stressor, the next day or the next few days or the next week, it's over. It's solvable, meaning there's something I can do about it. Well, I can skip the exam. That solves the issue. I can study for the exam. I can do something to mitigate the concern that's about to happen on Friday and improve my chances of doing better on the test or not. But all of this is overwhelming and stressful. It requires some attention. It requires some effort. It might even require some help. What we can even do for that exam is we can say, listen, you've been studying a lot. Let's help you kind of de-stress. Why don't you take a break? Why don't you spend 15 minutes playing a little video game? Why don't you have a bath tonight? We'll make you a nice meal. We can do all these things to cope with the test on Friday, and we get through it. Let me give you another example that's more relevant for you guys. Anybody afraid of flying? Awesome. Anybody really vulnerable emotionally? No, just kidding. Don't read me. Right. So flying's a great example of this, right? Flying is probably one of the main phobias out there, but people don't go to therapy for flying. Why? Because they probably fly, unless you have a job where you've just been promoted, you have to fly every week, you might fly once a year, or you camp, right? So, but we can conceptualize flying as a stressor. It's coming up, I can cope with it. Once I get to where I'm going, the stress is over. And people do that all the time. They actually, take a benzodiazepine and they get through the flight because it's just solving a problem. They know once they're off their plane, they're okay. Or they have a cocktail or something. But they just get through, or they grin and bear it. They distract themselves. They have coloring books and audio books. They have their husband or wife next to them, and they get through it. That's stress. Anxiety is different. Anxiety looks like this. Anxiety is a future-oriented problem. So this says, just think, Jake, somewhere and at some point, we could totally fail or something bad could happen, right? So anxiety is a future-oriented problem. There's no way to solve it because there's no actual problem yet. It's the perception of threat, but not actual danger. So something bad might happen in the future, and there's nothing we can do about it. And so we think, we churn, we worry, we get reassurance. And none of those things seem to mitigate the thing that we're worried about because it hasn't happened yet. It hasn't happened yet. And so the act of worrying becomes the coping skill. If I think about this a lot, maybe I'll ground myself in understanding something more that I might figure out. So the question is the difference between this. Stressor is, if I say, hey, I need some help. I'd like to lift this up, but despite my very nice physical appearance, I'm not very strong, so I can't lift it. That's a stressor. I need to lift this. Could I have some help with that? Somebody says, sure, I'll help you, and they pick it up for me. Great, thank you, we just solved the problem. I'm no longer stressed. I knew part of my presentation was to lift this. I was worried about it. It's been solved. Anxiety is, what if there's something up here that I might need to lift at some point? I don't know what, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to lift it or not. Can anybody help? And somebody might say, sure, I can be helpful. And they'll come up here and say, what do you want me to do? I'll say, well, I don't know, because I'm not really sure what I need lifting in the future, or I'm not really sure which piece needs lifting. So they just stand up trying to be supportive, but there's nothing they can actually do. And in fact, their presence takes away some of my confidence to know that if at some point I needed to have to lift something up here, I might actually be able to manage it myself. So stress is a current issue that's solvable. Anxiety is a future-oriented problem that we don't know exists yet. And so it looks like this. What if? What if something happens and I'm not able to tolerate it? What if I have a panic attack? What if my heart starts beating very quickly, my stomach hurts, I start sweating, and I look like a fool? Well, there's nobody in your life that can say, you'll be okay, because when somebody in your life says you'll be okay, you go, okay, but what if it happens, right? There's no way to solve it. So the best solution that many people do is to avoid. The best way I can prevent myself from having a panic attack in public or at school is I just won't go. What if in the future, I feel very anxious in front of a lot of people and they judge me negatively? What if people think I'm silly, foolish, weak, incompetent? Well, my mom and dad can't seem to tell me enough times that I'm none of those things. So the best way I avoid ever having to tolerate that feeling is I just don't try out for soccer. Because if I don't try out for soccer, or I don't speak in class, or I don't put myself out there, that's really the only way that I can really prevent myself from having to experience that awful distress. And what happens there is if I don't practice or experience ever feeling yucky emotionally, I have no practice, I have no data points to know that not only is that not as bad as I worry that it might be, but I'm actually able to tolerate it pretty well. And we only do this for our kids emotionally, because what most parents do is we offer up lots of help and suggestions to make sure they don't have to experience those things. And we don't do this for physical stuff, right? Any of your kids play sports? Look at all you braggers. I know. Yeah, 3 of them. Thanks. No, right? Your kids play sports, which means they probably practice. And if they play high school sports or middle school sports, they probably practice a lot. And I bet they get tired. And I bet their muscles hurt. Or they have ballet, or they have dance, or they have music. All of these things require physical distress. And I can nearly guarantee that many of you, when your kids come home from football practice or dance, and they say, I'm wrecked, my thighs are on fire. Most of us go, yeah, you're getting strong, right? You're growing. But when kids come home with emotional distress, I felt yucky today, we usually go, oh, let's figure out how to not have that happen again. And that's the piece we have to shift. We have to help our kids learn to increase their tolerance to that emotional stuff so that they feel capable of enduring any distress that comes their way, because everything is uncertain. We have no idea if we're going to panic or feel silly or foolish. If you engage in the world enough, chances are those things may happen. But a much better place is for your kids to know that if those things happen, they'll be able to endure it. And that's kind of the goal. Next slide, please. So what are the key features of an anxiety disorder? This happens for all of them. One is intolerance of uncertainty. So we see this in every single anxiety disorder. Sorry. No, that's okay. Thank you. Check. Hello? Okay. Intolerance of uncertainty. So many times the content of anxiety shifts. So it might be social, it might be panic, which is like physical stuff. It might be OCD, where there's a whole host of things that people worry about. It might be health anxiety, it might be school stress. But what mostly we are uncomfortable with is the idea of not knowing. So intolerance of uncertainty is a main component that we target for people that live with anxiety. Because think about that. We've described panic attacks, which is like, I don't know for sure. Even the people that I treat with panic disorder, if I told them, when you show up on Saturday and you're watching this presentation, you're going to have a panic attack. It's going to last 4 minutes. You're going to feel terrible. You'll be okay. Are you willing to go? They'll go, yeah, 4 minutes, no problem. But if I said you're going to show up, you don't know whether you're going to or not,
Most people go, I'll hedge my bets, I'll stay home. Not knowing. Separation anxiety, how do I know my parents will be safe? If I can guarantee you that they'll be okay, the anxiety, of course, goes away. It's not worry that their parents live this dangerous life. It's just a concern that they don't know for sure, despite all the evidence that their parents always get home safe. Intolerance of distress. So anxiety is manifested physically for most people. We feel it. The butterflies in the stomach. For kids, it's difficulty swallowing. It's the chest getting tight, the heart beating fast, the numbness in their fingers and toes. And we know biologically why your body does all of these things. But we don't like it. And once we associate it with distress, we want nothing to do with it. But it's only when uncertainty is high. So if, for example, I said to you, and before I'd mentioned that anxiety is a perception of threat, not actual danger, right? So when we actually endure danger and we have the same physiological response, we don't actually mind. And we don't necessarily associate it with anything obscure or bizarre. So, has anybody ever been in a car accident? Okay. Those guys leave first. Okay. Right? But when you've been hit by another car, you've hit another car, depending on how terrible it was, right? Most of us don't use the vocabulary to describe actual dangerous situations like we do with anxiety, right? With anxiety, we don't say when the car hits us, I was just flooded with intrusive thoughts and I didn't know what to do and get out. We just bummer. We start worrying about just insurance and stuff like that, right? If there was an actual danger in here, if there was an explosion over here and we all ran out into the parking lot as fast as you could, and I said, quick, tell me what's going on in your body, many of you would say, chest is tight. Having a hard time breathing. Whoa, I'm sweating. I feel dizzy. I feel shaky. I'd say, are you having a panic attack? And you say, no, we just ran from the explosion, silly, right? But if those things happen while you're sitting in class or you're watching TV or you're shopping at Target or you're driving your car, we have to come up with an explanation. And the explanation is I must be losing my mind and have some emotional disorder or distress. So that is what we call emotional reasoning. If I feel bad, there must be something wrong. And that's just not true. Sometimes you just feel bad. And the first time you feel bad from a panic attack and you change your behavior following that, you're basically conditioning that response to the thing you're afraid of. So once you start worrying about going to Target again, your body goes, oh, I remember. This is where you want me to activate? And everything in you is going, no, I just want to run in there really quickly, please. Or your kids are saying, I just want to get off the bus safely. Or I just want to get to school. Or I don't want to worry that something bad's going to happen to you. So these are the four main things. Emotional reasoning, intolerance of uncertainty, perception of threat, and intolerance of distress. Next slide. So this is emotional reasoning at play. It's just another helpful way to think about it. So you have a cow, and there's nothing wrong with it. You should have 4 legs. Let's click one there, and again. Yay, right? But if you have 4 legs, click again. Do you always have a cow? No. Why not? You can have something else. Click one more time. You can have a donkey, a horse, a table, right? It doesn't work. It's not a bidirectional relationship. So if you have danger, yeah, you should have a panic response. Your body should behave that way, but just because you have a panic response does not mean that there's danger. And what happens for most people suffering with anxiety is their body is responding all the time thinking it's doing them a favor. Is it now? Is it now? And once you change your behavior, is it now? I'm not sure, but I'll just back up. The brain thinks that there was something to avoid, and so that feeling is likely to come back over and over and over. So when your kid says, I'm really afraid you and dad are going out again on another date, I don't know when you're going to be back, and you say, listen, we're going to be okay. Here's all this reassurance. You're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. We love you. We'll call you. We'll check in with you when we get to the restaurant. We'll check in with you when we leave the restaurant. It sounds like a lovely meal. We'll check in with you on the way home, right? We hired 14 babysitters to make sure you're okay, right? What happens is that kid doesn't experience danger. Parents get home safe, but they don't have new learning that occurs. Learning doesn't shift and say, well, I'm okay, because what they believe is they're okay because of all those checks and balances. And so if you can think of that, there's thousands of those that we implement in people's lives on a regular basis. So it robs them of the experience that they're okay. They're not dying from their anxiety just because they're actually able to tolerate it. Next slide, please. So the question is this your fault? Next slide. The answer is yes. No, I'm just kidding. This isn't even a helpful question. Parents ask me all the time, is this my fault? It's the father's fault. Next slide. So it's not anyone's fault, and it's not even a helpful question, right? Because what happens is when parents start worrying about this, and then all serious, I know this is a significant concern because as parents, you're human. And as humans, you have your own vulnerabilities, right? And as humans, you have your own shame. And many of your shaming thoughts that come up, and they come up for all of you, so no one's immune to this, is, am I a good enough parent? And if your kid is suffering with an anxiety disorder or having a hard time in school or having a hard time emotionally or having a hard time at all, you have had this thought and this experience over and over and over. And it's not about you not being enough. There's a lot of other things that implement or that impact whether a child develops anxiety or not from a totally non-judgmental place. Anxiety functions just through conditioning, just through classical conditioning. And so if I started panicking, right, just as an example, if I started panicking right now, or my body started behaving that way, even if I got through the rest of the presentation, I went home, if I was invited back here tomorrow and I just walked close to this, my body would behave that way. That's just classical conditioning. So if I decide to not get back on stage and go, oh, wow, this is interesting, let's see what my body does. If I walk up to the stage and then I leave when I start feeling anxious, that stage now becomes conditioned to produce that response. We don't have to think about it. It's not part of our conscious awareness. It just happens. So it's not all your fault. Let's click one. So we got genetics, right? Those play a role. About 1/3%. That's why I always blame it on the dads, right? Because they're usually not at the intake appointment, so it's safer for me to do that. I'm like, oh, this is your husband's fault. Sorry, We have the environment, right, which is the next thing. So if you get the genetics, you have the propensity to develop an anxiety disorder. So for myself, for example, I have suffered with my own anxiety. My parents, along with my gap teeth, provided me the genetics to really have the propensity to develop an anxiety disorder, right? My wife, on the other hand, I don't know if it's a cold heart or she just doesn't have that gene. She just doesn't get that activated about stuff. So genetics really do play a role. So I am more susceptible than my wife because I don't think her parents suffer with anxiety. I know they don't. But my mom really did. And it's not my mom's fault, but there you have it. The environment plays a role. So I'll give you another example. I didn't have an anxiety disorder until I went to graduate school to specialize in anxiety disorders. And I got stuck in an elevator. And I had a panic attack. I'd never had one before. I was learning about it, so this was really helpful. This is a true story. And I got out of the elevator, and when I walked back to the elevator after class, I started panicking again. So I took the stairs. Right then, that was it. That's how an anxiety disorder is developed. So I might have the genetic ability, but it was there, and then that environmental trigger made it happen. So for some kids, it's a comment in class, right? It's when the kid goes, I know the answer, it's blue, and everyone goes, no, it's not blue, it's green. That feels so overwhelming and activates anxiety. One time, that's all it could be, right? For others, it's a panic response in a pretty neutral space. For others, it's I've worked with so many kids where they've been in class and a classmate vomited, and since then, they've been fearful of vomit for a long, long time and then avoided school and refused school, and they don't even know why. So the environment plays a role. But the next one is modeling, right? So the line there was trauma. Trauma certainly plays a role. We don't have time to talk about that today, but when something threatens your life or the perception that your life or someone you love is in danger, it absolutely shakes the ground that you walk on. And so that we know, other than a lot of other anxiety disorders, a traumatic event or a phobia kind of thing like I described is where the cause of anxiety can certainly come from. But then this is the anxious parent, right? And what you have to realize is that your behavior does absolutely impact your children. You know that because they say the same jokes that you say. They probably walk the same way that you walk. You catch them saying phrases that you think, I've never heard anyone say that. So we know that plays a role. The problem that many parents suffer with is their shame about, am I doing enough? Makes them smother their kids with layers of coping skills so they never have to experience distress. And many times that's because I don't want to experience distress. If you're distressed, that means I'm a bad mom or dad. So therefore, I will try and make you stay away from distress at all costs so I cannot be distressed. Because when you're in pain, I'm in pain, which we know is true. My 5-year-old, so I mentioned I'm a Ridgefield resident, and only now I have a 5-year-old who just started kindergarten at Southridge. And she was terrified getting on the bus, crying every day. We showed up for the first little orientation. She's like, Daddy, sit next to me. Daddy, sit next to me. And I'm watching around and I'm doing the thing that parents do, which is called comparison. And I'm going, those kids aren't asking their parents to sit next to them. Oh my gosh. And then I have to manage my own vulnerability. You specialize in the treatment of anxiety disorders, and your kid is the scaredest kid in this class, right? So I gave my wife a look like, this is all your fault. But I had to manage that, right? And it was painful. You guys know this experience. Getting her on the bus, truly, like snot coming out her nose, crying, coughing to the point of nearly vomiting, just getting her on the bus. It made sense that everything in me would have just said, let's just go home, or I'll drive you, or we'll come up with another plan, because I don't want to tolerate my distress right now, and I want you to feel better. And I can justify that all day long. She's 5 years old. Oh my gosh, this makes sense. How bad is this for her? She's feeling the cortisol levels in her brain are going up every time. It doesn't matter. She has to get through it, because I wasn't making decisions for the 5-year-old Quinn. I was making decisions for the 6-year-old Quinn and the 7-year-old Quinn and the 8-year-old Quinn, that if she fled that experience, it doesn't help her feel better. It actually exacerbates the chances that she will never get on that bus. And the more calm and collected that I can be, getting her on the bus, I can cry in my car later, right? But the more calm and collected I can be getting her on the bus, I'm modeling that this isn't dangerous. But if I'm going, you're going to be okay. Listen, you just need to get on the bus, okay? Right? I'm telling her, hey, level of agitation is higher. We should all be worried about this. So we do influence our kids tremendously. Next question. So we just talked about some of this, but because you are a loving, caring, responsible, amazing, magical, loving, caring, thoughtful, and organized parent, next slide, you may have become a safety behavior for your kiddo. So this is the piece I want you to think about, and I just talked about this a little bit. So what does that look like? So there's going to be some things that pop up here. So the next one is, you might anticipate their emotions, right? So think about these things if you're doing this. So do you think that might bother them, so I'm going to go ahead and not set that expectation or not ask them to do that thing? What else? You try to solve problems for them before they occurred. So I work with parents all the time, and they're always doing this for their kids. They're doing this for their kids academically. They're doing this for their kids emotionally. And so they're trying to they're kind of being mini assistants for their kids. And they're going, well, they're going to run up against this. Let's make sure they've got this and this. And again, this is developmentally normal, right? What I mean by that is, you have to take into account how old your child is. When they're 5, you have to do this for them. When they're 15, you shouldn't be doing this for them. What else? You interact with them as though they're fragile. This is a tough one, right? Because this is the modeling. If I treat you like you're not able to tolerate anything challenging emotionally, you will not be able to tolerate anything challenging emotionally. What's interesting about this as well is, because so I have a pediatric clinic and a regular clinic, general clinic. And for parents, I work with just awesome parents, right? They're everybody. They're you guys. And they're trying to get really good care for their kids. Don't know why they came to us. But anyway, and so I know they're really involved. And the kids will sometimes tell me things that are not terribly dramatic, but they'll say, I don't want my mom to know this. I don't want my dad to know this. And many times, and I know they're parents, so I'm like, I don't think your parent's going to think this is that big of a deal. And kids routinely say to me, oh, I don't think my mom could handle that. And conversely, mom is going, I keep everything from her. so she doesn't feel overwhelmed, so she doesn't feel stressed, so she doesn't know the difficulties of life, and so on and so forth. And what that is modeling is the kid is saying, this isn't about me. Mom can't handle this. So we want to stop this. Next one. Dropping expectations if there's emotional difficulty or agitation or irritability or what have you. Do you remind them excessively of their responsibilities? Again, I'm talking about kids that are capable of putting their school bag together and having their assignments together. But these are parents that are like refreshing their kids' grades. You have a junior paper due in 3 days. Let's make sure we work on that, Bill, right? And I'm anticipating problems. And if that turns in late, I'll go ahead and send an email to the teacher and make sure that she's aware that we've had some, always kind of micromanaging this stuff. What else? You feel responsible for their emotions. That's terrifying. Even my 5-year-old, I'm not responsible for her emotions. I feel bad when she's upset. So you are not responsible for your kids' emotions. You're not responsible for anyone's emotions. That's really important. Even if you get that out of this today, you can leave and engage in the world in a different way. Because right now, if you anticipate and rehearse the things that you say so you don't upset people or you don't impact other people, you are disallowing them from being responsible for their own responses. And that's the same with your kids. So it's not, and so if your kid's irritable and anxious and they're responding all the time with a lot of intense emotional stuff, so you change your interaction style with them, well, now their anxiety not only impacts them, but it impacts you. And most families that has a child with an anxiety disorder, they all behave like they have an anxiety disorder because they have all these accommodations set in place so that one kid is never triggered for their distress. And it just doesn't work. Spend more time on their homework than they do. That's a sign, right? I'm getting way better at coloring now than I have in a long time. What else? Order for them. So this is huge, right? So this is really, really important. These are such small things that we take for granted, but you guys have to engage the world in all sorts of ways, right? You get gas, you get groceries, you interact with people at restaurants, you interact with school personnel, your jobs, all these things. At a very young age, we can start putting more expectations on our kids to at least be aware of those things. I'll ask a 15-year-old how much gas is or a loaf of bread. They have no idea. You know why they don't know? Because when they pull up at the gas station, they're doing this. They're not watching anymore your interaction, even when you say, well, we're in Washington, 20 on regular, right? But they're not with you when you go in and you use your card or you go in to buy something and you say, excuse me, can you put $20 on pump 4? They don't get to see that anymore. Many of them would rather, and they're walking around the grocery store with you, but they're not with you. And so when it comes to them actually having to be responsible for something, we drop the expectation. And of course, because we worry about what people think of us, when we go to a restaurant and we say, what would you like? And they go, they'll have chicken nuggets and fries, please. Right? And we just avoid that interaction. And then we just drop it because we want to have a nice meal. We don't talk about the fact that they didn't order again until next time we go out to eat. And now we're back in the same boat again. So kids that don't order for themselves or speak up for themselves are typically suffering with social anxiety. But we don't want to do that stuff for them. Shop for them. That's another thing. I'm working with a girl right now. Very complex case. Lots of stuff going on. But she's 17. And we went to a rock climbing gym that her family's a member of, and I'm trying to work on building some confidence. And so the gentleman came over, and she doesn't speak, so she has selective mutism. My wife has that as well when I'm home. But so we're at the rock climbing gym, and I say, the very nice guy was like, what size shoes? What size shoes would you like? And I said to her, if you don't know the size of your shoe, it's okay just to kick your tennis shoe off and take a look. And she did. And so in that moment, she was not speaking, but she was also not able to say, hey, listen, I don't know the size of my shoe. We do everything. We're like personal assistants sometimes for our teenagers. and disallow them the opportunity to engage in the world. So when we shop for them, some kids don't even know what size clothes that they wear because parents come home with their outfits and curate their life. Communicate with other adults with them. This can look like emails to teachers or in stores or engaging with things all the time. So, the treatment that I do is called exposure therapy. It should be called vulnerability therapy. Exposure therapy has kind of a negative connotation, but it is helping people move towards the things that are mildly distressing. So, for example, if I'm working with a child that suffers with social anxiety, it means they worry about negative evaluation and judgment and certainty. What if I don't order correctly? What if I say it wrong? What if I spit when I talk or stutter? Or what if the person thinks I'm foolish? All of those worries and concerns keep them from engaging in the world. So for therapy, this is just one example. I'll take the kiddo out and we'll go and get coffee. And they have to order and engage and all those things. And it's anxiety provoking for me because I go, there you go. And the person says, what can I get you? And the kid goes, and I have to tolerate my own distress of just going, and the person's looking at me like, I have to allow that awkwardness and that distress, and I want the kid to feel it, because I want that to propel them to say, I'm not sure yet, or I need a minute, or I'll order this, or whatever it is. But without those opportunities, they don't know that that social consequence is there, and that they're able to conquer it. Because the kid that sits there for 5 minutes awkwardly, feels anxious and is able to order something and then get their hot chocolate or whatever they get, they can walk away going, I did that all by myself. It was awful, but I'm okay. And that's the experience we want people to have. For fun, I'll tell you another example. We do rejection interactions, so I want people to learn what it feels like to be rejected, because that's their biggest fear. What if I talk to someone and they ignore me? I would die. So we say, okay, we're going to do that. My office is on Burnside, so there's lots of odd people walking around. And so we walk up to people with a clipboard, and I do this with adults as well, and we stop and we say, excuse me, sir, do you have 22 minutes for a survey? And they go, no. And the first 3, person's sweating bullets. See, they hated me. They hated me. That's the interpretation of impolite interactions with people with social anxiety. It was me. But by the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th person that we've been rejected from, now it's just like, hey, would you want to do it? No. Okay, great, have a good day. Okay, next one, right? And we just go around, just boom, or we get flowers and we hand them out to people. We're looking for interactions that feel awkward or uncomfortable. Because if you can do that, at the end of class, you can say to your teacher, excuse me, I need help with an assignment. Because that compares not to that intensity. What else? So how is therapy helpful? Next slide. So I work from a cognitive behavioral framework. What that means is we look at people's thoughts, we look at people's feelings and their behaviors. When most people go to therapy, though, they think they're working on their feelings, right? We go to feel better. I want to feel less anxious. I want to feel less depressed, less irritable. I want to feel more confident. But we can't change that directly. It's impossible. And so when we tell people to cheer up or think positive, it's not very effective. Right? So, right off the bat, put an X through that feelings. We're not working on it. We have some control over our thoughts, but we do not have 100% control over our thoughts. So I can ask you to think about this coffee cup, and you can. Congratulations. I can even hide the coffee cup and ask you to think about it, and you can. But if I ask you not to think about the coffee cup, whatever you do, don't think about the coffee cup. Just don't, right? It becomes nearly impossible. So, and that's a coffee cup, but when that's a self-deprecating thought or a negative thought or an intrusive thought, it becomes really hard just not to think about it because we don't have that much control over our thoughts. So it usually looks like this. Hey, Kevin, you're ugly. No one likes you. Oh, I don't want to think that. Look, distract. And the thought goes, oh, no. Nope, look, the thought's still there. Okay, I'll distract some more. Netflix, YouTube, video games, right? Drugs, alcohol, avoidance, whatever. And what I'm telling my brain is that thought is so scary that I can't manage it. Until, like we talked about earlier, once I go to bed, all those distraction things turn off. And guess what's sitting there waiting for me? Going, you've avoided me all day, but I'm not going anywhere. So we can't just will negative thoughts out of our head. I mean, we know this because we get songs stuck in our head all the time, right? But what we have 100% control over is our behavior. And because there's an arrow going both ways, these are bidirectional relationships, we know if we influence our behavior, our thoughts and feelings will be manipulated as well. So a basic example is, if you feel depressed, you have thoughts that you're no good. And when you feel depressed and you have thoughts that you no good, you're more likely to behave by isolating. When you isolate, you then have thoughts that I'm no good, which contributes to feeling sad, which means you stay home even more. And you can see how you get stuck. With anxiety, it's avoidance. If I have thoughts that something bad might happen, it makes me feel anxious, and my behavior is that of avoidance. Subtly in a lot of different ways, reassurance seeking, whatever. That contributes to the belief that I'm okay because nothing bad happened to me, but I'm only okay because I avoid it. So what we do in cognitive behavioral therapy is we focus heavily on the behavior. And that's why exposure therapy is a type of cognitive behavioral therapy, because what we're saying is, especially for children, listen, you can't talk your way out of this. Talking about being anxious usually makes us more anxious. And I have yet to meet an 11-year-old that sits across from me on my couch and crosses his legs and say, it's good to see you again. Let's chat about all my concerns, right? They don't even have to understand why they're afraid. So if I have a kid that has separation anxiety, doesn't want to be away from his mom, I can talk to him about how unrealistic it is and how many times in your life has your mom ever disappeared? Well, never. Okay, well, what are the chances you think that, right? And that's a lot for a 10 or 11-year-old. I've already lost him, by the way, like 40 seconds ago, right? I learned this when I was a new therapist because I would have these like really profound conversations with kids. And then I would say, you know, what you get taught, like in school to be a therapist, you say like, so, could you reflect for me on some of the things that I just said? And I just nailed it with this kid. I was like on it. And I think he said like, cats are cool. And I was like, wow, that was a big waste of your parents' money. Sorry about this, right? But what I can do with that kid is I can get a good understanding that they trust me and that I'm safe. And I can tell them, you know when you feel bad, you kind of get stuck and you don't want to do stuff? I bet I can change the way that you feel just by changing your behavior. And we come up with all different analogies and fun ways to do this. But we don't just play in the office. What I'll say to a kid that's afraid of being away from his mom is I'll say, well, we're going to go for a walk, me, you, and your mom. And what I want you to do is I want you to walk 10 steps ahead of us, but you're not allowed to look behind you. And I promise we will never trick you. We will never disappear. We will never dip out. But what happens when he's 10 steps in front of his mom and I, everything in him wants to look behind him. And the only way to build tolerance to that he can trust his experience is that if he practices that over and over. And within a couple sessions, this kid is walking around a few blocks and coming back to the clinic all by himself, and he's building tolerance through behavior, through evidence, actual evidence that something can change, not just talking about it. So there's lots of different therapies out there. This is one perspective. There's many perspectives on how to help people get better. Mine is the right one. And I should say cognitive behavioral therapy, these aren't my opinions. This is heavily researched. This is the evidence-based treatment. This is the gold standard treatment for anxiety disorders. So what can you do for your kid? Let's go to the next slide. So you can identify patterns of avoidance and safety. So I know as I'm talking here, you're just going, oh, that's yeah, he does that. Oh, I do that. So pay attention to those things, right? Just acknowledge them. What I ask parents to do is just write them down. What are all the things you do for your kid? Right? All of them. And then ask yourself, get a marker or a highlighter and highlight, what are actually all the things you do for your kid's anxiety? Because I want you doing everything you want for your children, because I'm sure they're lovely and awful. I mean, lovely. I actually didn't mean to say awful. That's pretty funny. I'm sure they're lovely and awesome. But I don't want you doing things for their anxiety, and it's important that you can tell the difference. Because once you stop doing things for their anxiety, they have to learn to cope more, tolerate more, and they build confidence. When you do something for them for their anxiety, it disallows them the sense of knowing that they're capable. That is so important for self-esteem and confidence, is capability. And so if I take my daughter to school every day, and school's great now. No one asked, but she's doing fine, thanks. Right? School's great, but if I drove her, she would have always said in her head, I'm okay, but it's because Dad drove me. Not that I got through that awful yuckiness and it turned out okay. Oh, sorry, can we go back? Identify how you maintain these behaviors. Develop a plan on reducing them. So don't leave today and going, wow, we got a long list, let's stop them, right? That will cause meltdown, right? It has to be a plan and a conversation. Increase child experiences of competence and feeling capable. That can truly be, hey, when we go grocery shopping, here's half the list. You get your own cart, go and do those. And if they can't do that, here's one thing at a time. And if they can't do that, here's one thing that I know is on this aisle. I'm still here, but I'm going to turn this way while you go and get it and come back. That builds capability. And if they can't do that, you're out of luck. No, I'm just kidding. My point is, you can always reduce the intensity and the fear of what it is, and then create a graded exposure or just an incremental strategy to get somebody to do something. And it's amazing how those small things can shift a kid who sits like this to sit like this. Increase empathy and communication. We could spend hours on this. Empathy for your children is really about listening, and it's about having a perspective, their perspective. It is not about agreeing with their perspective, but it's about seeing their perspective from where they're at. So whether they're 5 or they're 15 or they're 30. One of my best advices for you in communicating with your children or with your spouses or with your coworkers is when you listen and talk with them, do this. Because most of us are just waiting for our turn to talk, right? So when in conversations, I'm saying something that triggers a thought of yours, you stop listening and start rehearsing your response. That's why we never remember people's names when we meet them, right? Because you're going, I'm Kevin. Hi, I'm Kevin. And you walk away and go, what was his name? No clue, right? So it really is helpful for you to just be present and listen and to not give advice. And parents are really good at giving advice, right? So, because this is what happens. Kids come home from school, hey, how was your day? Stupid. What? Why? Mr. Smith gave me an F. I hate Sarah, she's a jerk. I'm never going back to school again. And parents go, well, he didn't give you an F, you earned an F. We'd already talked about that assignment. I've told you not to hang out with Sarah, and please don't use the word jerk when we're talking, right? And the next day, parents go, how was school? And the kid goes, fine, right? They didn't get hurt at all. And it doesn't mean that talking about Mr. Smith that way or Sarah that way or whatever is okay or part of your expectations of your household, but you can address that later. But right now, all that needs to be done is some validation, like, today was rough. Tough day. I'm sorry you feel that way. Do you want to talk about it? And inevitably they'll say, nope. And so then you can say, well, cool, I'm going to be over here doing my thing. If you ever want to talk about it, let me know. But we are so ready to put out fires for kids all the time for teenagers, right? If a kid says to you, I'm really stressed about my biology project. Well, have you done this? Have you planned that? Did you talk to the teacher? Did you send an email? What are your friends doing? Right? Instead of just letting them experience, they're not even asking for help. Empathy is just going, you sound really overwhelmed. And as parents, what we could do is say, because you have a lot of wisdom, right? You've got actually really good advice, but that doesn't work that well when you just give it, especially to your children, right? And so what works very well is if you say, I got some ideas about how you could help with that. Want to hear them? And now it changes the game. They're like, what? You're asking me if I would like some advice? Yeah, actually, I'll take some of that. And if they say no, you can say, well, I'll be over here. Because what you're creating then is a relationship. The relationship is, they're always here for me. They're not frustrated if I'm not talking to them. but they're not going to jump down my throat with 100 solutions. Because we do this all the time. Like when if I get home and I say, I'm exhausted, I'm so tired, I saw 9 patients today, which means 9 hours of therapy. My wife says, well, have you thought about not seeing as many patients? Like, that would solve the problem. Like, that's not what I want to hear. I want you just to say, wow, you're a really hard worker. Sounds like a long day. I just want to be validated. So that's the empathy piece. It's not sympathy. Sympathy is undercutting the experience. I had a really tough day. Yeah, I know, but you got a lot done. Oh, you're not hearing me again. Or what parents do is, Mom, I'm sad. Oh, want a sandwich? Right? What it's saying is, I don't want to listen to that either, but I'll make something because that's what helps me feel good and give it to you because I did my job then as a mom, right? Help improve sleep, exercise, and diet. This is huge. We could go on about this too. Sleep is probably the most important thing your kids need consistently. And it's hard. They get older. School starts much earlier. We don't have control over that. But creating a sleep routine is so important. We sleep a third of our life. Right? A third of our life we sleep. It's necessary. And when we disrupt that, it has a whole bunch of implications and a lot of other issues, both medical and emotional. Okay, next slide. So what can you do for yourself? We'll do this and we'll take some questions. Identify what's your stuff versus what's your kid's stuff. That's not easy. Acknowledge that you're not responsible for anyone else's emotions. You're already really good at that. Model self-care. So here's the difference, right? I'm suggesting that you don't cope with anxiety. I'm suggesting that you build tolerance for anxiety. But what? Everybody tells me that I should exercise. Everybody should. Yes, you should. And you should do a lot of other really good things for yourself if they work for you. Don't pretend like you're going to exercise if you've never exercised. It's not your thing, right? But there's other things you can do to care for yourself. But you have to model that because you can't say to our kids, I think therapy would be really helpful for you. And I say, that's great. Have you ever gone to therapy? Oh, no, we don't go to therapy, right? But my kid should go to therapy, right? Because therapy for your child is therapy for you guys as well. But you have to model that. Increase empathy and communication. Increase empathy and communication. And then improve sleep, diet, and exercise for yourself. So a lot of this is modeling that calmness, that assertiveness, the expectations. Next slide. So obviously I don't take myself very seriously, so I always include some kind of picture at the end of my slides so people can see it. Because I really do think that we take life a little too seriously, and this stuff is really scary, and if you're living with a kid that's struggling, it is really scary. But therapy can be done in a very dynamic way, and there is hope. Everybody can be helped, because when you break it down to these very simple behavioral mechanisms and we get out of this really like heady cognitive stuff, you can learn that a lot of this stuff is solvable. Here's some contact information for Northwest Anxiety Institute, although I'm realizing that phone number is incorrect. I'm also really good at marketing, just so you know. It's 542-7635. But we have a website, so check that out. So we've got time for questions. We have a mic if you have some questions already now. Because I said mic, you thought about not asking your question. But be brave. Ask a question because somebody else probably has the same one. Anybody questions? We have one all the way in the back there.
Hi, so I've got a question. I work with some kiddos that have developmental disabilities. How do you guys work with kids that have anxiety issues kind of coupled with the developmental delays?
Yeah, good question. That certainly adds layers of complexity. So what I'll say is we don't often see kids with developmental disabilities because typically there are people that specialize in working with kids with developmental disabilities. Now, it doesn't mean that they're immune from the same anxiety causes that everybody else is, but it also makes sense that they're experiencing anxiety for other reasons that the type of therapy that we do just probably wouldn't be helpful for. So an example of that is We see a fair amount of children that are on the autism spectrum, and they have anxiety engaging socially. It's not that, which makes sense because they struggle to engage socially. So, but often if they can increase their social competence, they can do a better job of engaging, which would reduce their anxiety versus helping them tolerate more anxiety, because they actually need the skills first. So that would be an example of how, depending on what the concern is, we would just have to evaluate what's driving the anxiety. Is it actually a core fear, or is it just a function of their other disability, perhaps?
You mentioned skin picking. Would you consider fingernail biting and cuticle chewing in that same family of behavior?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we categorize those as body-focused repetitive disorders. And again, we only call things a disorder when they're impairing and distressing. Okay, that's really important. So many things that many of us do can, and depending on the day and the week, can look like an anxiety-type behavior. If you've got a big pressure coming, like a big stressor coming up, again, it might just be a normal reaction to life. But if it's pervasive, it happens all the time, it's causing distress, then it's a problem. So a lot of people pick and chew their fingernails or their skin or pull their hair once in a while. How impairing and how distressing is it? And so we look at like the function, like why do you do that? So many people that pick, pull their hair, or pick their skin do it in two different ways. One's an automatic, so they're like, once I get in front of the TV, before I realize it, I've got no fingernails left, or I've kind of opened up a wound, or pulled my hair. Others do it very, very specifically in the mirror. And so what happens is, from a conditioned response, is that couch or that bed or the car or wherever they get stuck, that's just where they go back into this kind of conditioned rote behavior. And so there's very specific strategies that we would do to help somebody with that. Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I'm an elementary school teacher, and I was wondering if there are resources for schools and stuff that kind of tap into what you've been talking about.
Yeah, resources outside of like trainings or things like that. Yeah. I mean, I can direct people to, it's such a necessary overlap, but the clinical world, of course, is so different than the school world. Yet that's where you are seeing all of this, right? I see very specific cases that happen to show up at my door. So, I mean, the way Northwest Anxiety has been helpful as a resource is I will do in-services and trainings and things like that. And so I've done tons of those where they're a little bit more in depth, they're more engaged. And it's tricky because it's not about figuring out how to solve the problem, because you're not therapists, and you're also trying to teach them other things and have 30 kids in your class and so on and so forth. So sometimes it is helpful, though, to learn what behaviors contribute to additional anxiety type behaviors so that the maintenance is the same. So teaching about things like that is usually really helpful. So the resource I could offer would be doing trainings or things like that, presentations. Yeah. I think there was a question over here, Jason.
In trying to identify it, the anxiety in the kids is like easily breaking down and crying for things that seem like they would be just no real big deal to everyday occurrence. Is that something you'd want to look for? Or?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's a great question. A really good observation is, especially when you're around other children, we get a gauge, right? And we do compare, right? And so we say, well, these other kids don't seem to do this. That, to me, describes just feeling overwhelmed. We want to know what kind of drives that. And so I would, there'd be specific questions I would ask, like, and how predictable is it? Many times anxiety is really, really predictable, and we just forget. And so you can probably, if you started even writing it in your phone in a notes section when that happens, you start to look at what happens before and what happens after. So it seems to be always before I leave for the weekend on a trip, or it seems to be always when they've not been fed, or what is the common denominator to these meltdowns or emotional kind of outbursts. That might give you some idea. And then how is it impacting or derailing the day-to-day function, right? Like if it's always before we go to the store, but when this happens we don't, and then one of us goes by ourselves later in the evening, that has a function. And that likely is going to reinforce, well, great, when dad goes to the store later by himself, kiddo is home with mom all by themselves. That's really comforting and lovely. Perhaps that has something to do with it. So sometimes the thing that triggers the distress is not the thing that maintains it, because the thing that maintains it is what happens after becomes so rewarding. So you just kind of become like a detective and start going, well, I wonder what it is. And then and how old is the child?
8 years old.
8. So yeah, you definitely at an age where you can say, I wonder if, and so I would kind of do scenarios above and beyond. So could you share an example of like what might trigger that?
Most recent one was starting with the new baseball team.
Yep.
Breaking down crying because he doesn't know anybody.
Yeah.
And we know that once he does get in and starts playing with the other kids, he'll have a blast,
Yep.
and he'll really open up and have a great time.
Yep.
But getting up to that point,
Yep.
it's a sob fest. You know, you just
Yeah.
he
Oh my
really
God, you're
closes
describing
down
my
and
kid.
crying.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Right? Yeah, so what I would assess for, I think we probably know the answer to this, but I would say things like, if you could pick that whole team and they were everyone you know, would you go? Yeah, I would go, no problem. So then we know it's not performance or baseball, right? So we can just rule that out, right? So, but if you did nothing, but you had to hang out with the same people on your team tomorrow at JJ Jump or somewhere else, could you do that? Don't want to do that. Okay, so we know it's that what he's feeling is yuck. He's feeling yucky in anticipation. So then what you have to kind of do is, comfort and support with your words, but then that's where the incentive comes in a little bit higher, right? Like, I know this is really hard for you, and the expectation is not shifting, right? And you don't have to, and the expectation is not, you say, I know this is really hard for you, man, but you're going to get in there, you're going to have a lot of fun. And if you get through, once you get through 3 practices, we're going to get frozen yogurt on the way home, or we're going to, because sometimes, and this not all the time, but sometimes the reward is exciting enough that he can go, oh, I guess if I get frozen yogurt or that Lego kit, I can really get through this. Because that's still teaching him a lot. He's still having to go through the motion. He's not learning that when I'm distressed, I get something. I promise you that. What he's learning is I feel yucky, and I got through it. And then, of course, that doesn't happen every 3 times he goes to practice, or else you'll be broke and homeless. So you can, because what we're banking on here is learning happens, because after 3 practices, the chances of him becoming friends with somebody is pretty high, and the coach involving people and doing all these things, so it becomes a non-issue. So it sounds like I would label that anxiety. It sounds also to be pretty typical. I wouldn't call it a disorder unless there's other things. But so the other thing you can do, this is a great example, so is increase competence outside of practice. So have him let the tether out when you go to the grocery store or interact with people, or hey, can you go and ask that person for 2 menus, please? Even if you don't need 2 menus, right? Hey, can you go and throw this away for me? Because every time he's away interacting with new people or new kids or whatever, he's building competence and he's building a little bit of confidence. So you can do that outside of baseball as well, and that applies for everyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome. At the back there, Jason.
One thing that you haven't mentioned is medication.
Yeah.
Is that something that derails the treatment, or?
No, excellent question. Go ahead. Did you have another?
That's
okay.
it. Just want to know how the medication helps, or.
Yeah. So the medication so I'm not a prescriber, but I can tell you what the research, the literature, and also what most of the people in my practice kind of have. So the medication for anxiety is typically an SSRI. So it's the same medicine they would give for someone that has concerns with depression. So something like Prozac or Luvox or Lexapro or something like that. That's typically what is prescribed. Now, it is effective about 50% of the time. So it's a coin flip, right? Now, what does effective mean? I've described a lot of behaviors here, right? And so medicine isn't going to undo behaviors, but what it can do for people with anxious thoughts is it can kind of turn them down a little bit, which allows them to behave differently. What we find is if somebody starts a SSRI for an anxiety, usually it's for like worry, excessive worry. Some people will say, oh my goodness, I'm a different person. That helped tremendously. Most people will say, I don't know if it's doing anything, but I'm not having any side effects, so I'll just stay on it. And then they end up on it for years and years and years, but now they're kind of hooked. Not hooked physiologically, that's not the best term. They are conditioned to believe that that's the thing that has got them by all this time, when it's not, it's themselves, but it does take a little bit of confidence away. So for things like panic disorder, social anxiety disorder, I wouldn't recommend that people start medication. It's just not indicated. For generalized anxiety disorder, which is excessive worry and obsessive compulsive disorder, it is indicated more so. But again, it's still about 50% of the time effective. The other type of medicine that people often prescribe, generally not as much in kids, is a benzodiazepine, which is the Valium, the Xanax, the stuff we all really like, because it's very short acting and it helps like this. Although we build physically we build tolerance to it very quickly. So if I was about to walk up here and I took my Xanax so I didn't panic, it would really turn down the volume of my physiology. So therefore, I'm not thinking from a fear-based place, so I'm not changing my behavior. But I need that now everywhere I go. So people that have taken benzodiazepines kind of rely on them, and then you do become very tolerant, you become dependent on them. They have a high addiction property. So, yeah.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for all that awesome information. So I'm walking home with a big mirror in my face, and I just know all those things you said I'm totally guilty of.
Oh, thank you for sharing that.
So I have a 12-year-old girl, and pretty much everything you said in the very beginning that identifies somebody who has an anxiety, like 99%, is what she is.
Yeah.
And of course, I can't ask you a million questions about all the things that she's dealing with, but if I had to pick something, it's going to bed.
Yep.
So I'm sitting here yawning because over the last 2 months or so, I haven't slept alone in my bed with my husband because she comes in with nightmares. She doesn't fall asleep unless I do EMDR with her or it's just some kind of coping mechanism to get through some of the fears that she has. So locking doors, tornadoes. Somebody told her about the big crack out in the ocean that could, that's 100 years overdue. Somebody telling her, she watched a movie that was scary, some stick monster people. A friend of her told her a story about a man licking her hand under the bed or something, like crazy, creepy stories. So when you say exposing them to what makes them afraid, should I let her watch Twister? Should I let her watch that scary movie again? Should I read those?
No, glad you're asking these questions.
Okay, good.
No, I mean, exposure therapy is a very specific therapy that can only be done by somebody that's highly trained in providing it. So the recommendation is not that you expose her to it. What you can start doing is that list of things that you do. That sounds like it's going to be a really long list. And you can really talk about how you can help her build confidence by you reducing reassurance. But what you have to do is pick one thing and focus on it. But I would really just encourage you to connect with somebody that understands anxiety disorders, a clinician, and so they can help walk you through that process. Because what you can find is you don't have to do exposure for 1,000 fears. All we're exposing her to is the physical discomfort of not feeling good, anxiety, and the intolerance of uncertainty. Those are the only two things. So exposures are crafted to target those two. Her content happens to be twisters, scary people, monsters under the bed. That's just her content. But the process is the same. She's afraid of not knowing, and she's afraid of what if. And so the only reason she her anxiety tells her she's alive today is because she checks under the bed, she double locks, parents are there, they don't leave, they stay in with her, they do these things to distract her until she's so exhausted. That's the only reason I'm okay. Otherwise, those things would have gotten me. So you don't have to, like, it generalizes very, very quickly for all of us, for children and adults, when we're doing this specific work. But again, we're looking at impairment and distress, and I think it's there, right? And once you start, your sleep is disrupted, it becomes really hard for you to be helpful and to have a kind of a logical part of your brain to be helpful. Think about, when your child gets super emotional, anxious, angry, consider them losing 30 IQ points, right? So we all have an average IQ of 100, and so if they lose 30 of those, they're not functioning very well at all. But that happens to us as well. So we lose 30 IQ points, and they lose 30 IQ points, and now you've got two people with the equivalent IQ of people that don't do very well trying to problem solve situations. So I would look at the predictability of all these things, and then I would look at creating a plan of saying, we know tonight that she's not going to go to bed. But what most of us do is we just hope that that's going to change. And then we say, okay, it's time for bed. I don't am. We look at each other like, again? Well, of course, it's been like that for 4 years, or for 6 years, or for however long it is. And so, but we have to have a plan in place. I would encourage you to connect with a clinician to work out some of this. And you seeing EMDR tells me that you've talked to somebody. It's not actually evidence-based treatment for any of that stuff. So that makes sense to me that it's not helpful. And again, the proof's in the pudding, right? Like if therapy is helpful, therapy is really, really expensive, and it's a huge commitment. And I'm okay charging a significant amount of money because I also am super invested in people getting better. But if it's not getting better, if people aren't getting better, then my hypothesis of why somebody is engaged in the behaviors that they're engaged in is probably off, and I have to reformulate that. But it's frustrating for me. I have to kind of hold my bias in, but it's frustrating for me to hear that she's suffering and that she's doing a type of therapy that's not effective, and that somebody is not necessarily saying, hey, this isn't, it depends on how long, there's a lot of circumstance, but like sometimes if I'm not helpful, I'll say, for whatever reason, this isn't working. Let's not keep doing appointments where I'm charging you a lot of money and your family a lot of money if you're not getting to where you need to be. So give us a call. Yeah.
What would you suggest for a child that just refuses to see her small victories and her competencies and refuses to acknowledge those and kind of build upon them?
Yeah, I wonder, I wonder if how much weight she's putting into, so for kids, many times, right, this sounds like a shame type stuff, right, like a self-esteem kind of thing. Because what we acknowledge as victories, if kids see those as basic expectations for other kids, they feel patronized by the victory, right? So if I've had a hard time going to school and I'm 10, and my brother goes to school no problem, he's 12, and I finally get back into school and parents go, you did it, buddy, you did it. And they're like, oh my goodness. Right? It doesn't feel like, even though parents are like, come on, like we're pumping you up here, we're so proud of you. But for them, they're like, don't tell me this. Like their poor sense of self is still nagging at them saying, yeah, you're doing the bare minimum. And often what's happening is they feel like they're still not accomplishing other things. And so it might be like they don't feel justified in acknowledging that they're doing something well. It takes some work to figure out like when that started, what's causing that, how would we kind of manage that. I kind of have a sense to, many times the interventions we do in therapy are a paradox. So I would probably, I'm not giving you advice, but I would probably, working with kids similarly, think about reducing the amount of praise that you give or doing it as subtly as you can. And sometimes that can be much more effective, where you're just like, hey, good job, hit me right here, nice, right? Because for some kids, because they're also socially anxious, that they won't even perform for fear that somebody's going to acknowledge that, right? Like, don't turn to me and say, good job. That's terrifying, so I'll do mediocre so that never happens. I don't want the teacher randomly in class putting some crown on my head telling me I did an amazing job. Like, the idea that that happens is terrifying for some people. So sometimes the subtle acknowledgments can be better. Or, how old is this person? 9. So 9, I would say, I feel kind of stuck about how to tell you you're doing awesome. Sorry, I mean how you're doing okay. What do you think would be a way that you and I can have I can let you know that that was awesome, but we don't have to make a big deal out of it. And I would let them come up with, and it's amazing how creative kids could be. It could be a pound it or a high five, or it could be, when you come, if you think I did awesome, you turn that coffee cup upside down on the kitchen counter. When I walk by, I know that's there. I know you're thinking about me. And you'd be surprised at letting them offer up some idea of I'm having a hard time with this. Or sometimes, and depending if they hate this, you don't do it, but it might be at 9, I just kind of want to do a Monday through Sunday kind of tracker. I'm really curious. I kind of think I know how awesome you are, but I want to know how awesome you think you are. Put a little star on that tracker every time you think you did something awesome. I'm not even going to check in with you about it. I don't even know what the things are. I don't care. You have to, I don't really care. And then just see at the end of the week, and if there's nothing on there, then you can say, what got in the way of filling out the tracker? And if it's, I didn't do anything awesome, now we have to come up with a different strategy. But I wonder if there's things on there, and the less you care, the less you look like you care. It's a paradox. The more enjoyment or fulfilled that you're helping them see. So those might be some ideas that I would inquire about. So the second week that my daughter was in kindergarten, I've never had a kid in kindergarten, so I thought, you're supposed to come home and ask everything they did all day. And she said to me the second week, you don't have to ask me every single day how the day was. I said, okay, fair enough. And I remember she said, I got into the treasure chest at school. I said, that is awesome, good job. She goes, Dad, everybody gets into the treasure chest. Southridge. She also learned, anybody else kids go to Southridge? She also learned that in kindergarten, what the frontal lobe was, the hippocampus, and the limbic system. Kindergarten. Anyway, hopefully that's helpful. Another question here?
Sometimes my daughter has panic attacks in which she's not able to pinpoint the reason. I'll ask her, what was happening, or, how were you feeling at the time or something? And she'll just say, I was sitting in class and all of a sudden I started crying, had to leave. She's done it at home too, so there's not really any rhyme or reason, and I'm not sure how to respond to that.
Yeah, I would respond with just lots of empathy. I would try and not ask why. We're as humans, we really want meaning in everything, and so we get stuck trying to understand the why. Why? Because it implies that if we figure out the why, we can somehow solve a problem. But that's not true necessarily, right? Sometimes you can say, well, I remember as an adult I'm very emotionally vulnerable because in the 5th grade I figured out through years of psychodynamic therapy that 2 kids picked on me and cool, I figured that out. That doesn't change anything about tomorrow. But what she's telling you is actually spot on for the diagnosis of panic disorder. It is out of the blue. That's part of the diagnostic criteria. And then the disorder is people start worrying or anticipating future attacks because it's out of the blue. So if there's presentations in class and I have social anxiety and I panic in anticipation of, now I know I'm panicking because there's a presentation. So it's not panic disorder, it's social anxiety. If I have OCD and I worry about contamination and germs, well, I wasn't able to wash my hands, so I had a panic attack. But panic disorder arguably, I think it's just so scary for people because I don't know. I can't figure it out. It's my body literally behaving inaccurately, and it's turning on this fight or flight system, and I have no idea what to do. So what people do is they become very intolerant of the symptoms they associate with panic. So they stop walking as fast sometimes or running upstairs because they don't want their heartbeat to go up, or they don't want to sweat, or they don't want to do things. And so what I would do for now is just, oh, that sounds awful. I'm so sorry. I wonder, how often is that happening? And maybe she tells you anyway. But if she starts to worry about those coming back, I would talk to somebody. So there's very specific things people can do very quickly to help her not be afraid of that. Because that can pull her distraction, right? The whole time she's in class, she can just be like trying to pull down her physiology. Okay, please don't, not today, not right now. And that becomes overwhelming.
Go one more?
Yeah, one more?
One more?
One more question?
Right up here.
So I just want to reiterate a lot of what these people have been saying about how you're looking at yourself in the mirror saying, oh my gosh, I've done that, I've done that, I've done that. But I have consciously tried to, my daughter and I have a very open relationship. She'll come to me and she'll say, this is how I feel, this is what happened today, what do I do about it? And so I try to listen, and I try to be, like you said, empathetic, and I'll let her listen, and I'll let her finish, and I won't interrupt, and I'll let her do it. And then and then she's expecting me to give her that feedback. But it's like then once I give the feedback, it's not what she wants to hear.
Yes.
So then it's a frustration, and it goes back and forth. So there's no win. There's no. Yeah. And then she's just much more frustrated because I didn't give her the answer that she wanted to hear, or I just don't know what to do at this point. She's 10.
She's 10.
Yeah.
So she's too old to give up for adoption.
No, she's too old.
But you can have this conversation where this is what's amazing about these little people in our lives, right? You can say, I'm feeling kind of stuck. What do you mean? And I would do this not when she's looking for advice. So, on another day. This is the other time when to have these conversations. It's not after the meltdown or before the expectation that's not met or what have you. But you just say, I've noticed. So there's the very non-judgmental way to start every conversation. I've noticed. Hey, I've noticed that when you come to me when you're having a hard time, which, by the way, I love. I think it's so cool that you do that. Thank you. And she'll kind of roll her eyes. And then you say, but I've noticed that when I try and make some suggestions, it just seems to bug you even more.
Right.
I wonder if there's something else you're looking for me, if you're looking for from me. What do you mean? Well, I don't know. I have lots of ideas, but it doesn't mean they're the right ones.
Right.
And I wonder if what she's looking for is an insolvable problem, right? There's not a solution because it's not a stressor that you can say, if you do X, Y, Z, things will feel better tomorrow.
Right.
What she wants is to feel better, and the conversation's not helping her feel better.
Right.
And so I might even say something like, I might help her acknowledge that. How are you feeling when we're talking about this? And I would just empathize, and when she says, well, what do I do? And I would, well, it seems like there's not a whole lot we can do. Yeah. It sounds like you're really worried about something, but it hasn't happened yet. I'm not quite sure what we can do. Right. I wonder what really you're afraid of.
Right.
Right? Yeah. I wonder what you're afraid of. And is she talking about school stuff or interpersonal stuff?
Both. She's talking about school stuff. She's on the leadership team. She's a perfectionist. She wants this award. She's doing everything she can to get the award. She doesn't understand why she's not getting the award. What am I not doing right to get this award? She'll come to me. She has a younger sister. She compares herself to everyone else. Very perfectionist. I try to and I validate it, and I listen, and I validate, and I understand. But she's looking
she's
me
a
to solve
perfectionist. You're not giving her the right answer.
Yeah, she's looking me to solve the problem, which I can't solve. But I want to make her not hurt and worry anymore, and just be confident. And
you can't do that.
You know what I mean?
Right. So I think what you can help her reflect. So what I'm hearing you say is, I can't solve the problem. But I also don't want her to worry, so I still try and solve the problem, even though I know there's no problem to solve. Right. So I think letting her know that, listen, it kills me, or however you would say it, right?
Yeah.
To see you upset. And I know these things are so important to you. But do you think there's anything that you could actually do right now to change the grade or the award or what do you think?
And I would let her that.
I would let her come to, well, there's nothing right now.
That's
right.
Pretty much.
So what we can do is, it just sounds like it's really uncomfortable. And that's a bummer because it matters to you. And as long as things matter to us, we're going to feel anxious. That's not an indicator that something's bad, right? It matters to me that I do a good job today, so I was nervous prior to. It would be odd if I wasn't, because it matters. If I didn't care, I could walk up here like a sociopath, I guess, and not have any physiology thing, anything happening in here, right? So when many of you ask a question, it matters that you sound articulate and put together, so you sweated a little bit before the mic came, right? It's just how it happens, right? So what we have to do with our kids is help them learn that's not that yuckiness. It doesn't mean you're failing, you're doing it bad. That might just, because you care a lot, that comes along with the territory. So I will work with kids that are, planning on going to an Ivy League school, and they're captain of their football team, and they play lacrosse also, and they're AB all their classes, and they say, well, I'm really anxious. And I said, well, what are you going to give up? Well, nothing. Well, of course you're anxious. You get 4 hours of sleep a night, and you want to be the most amazing person in the world, which is great. Good for you. But with that comes stress. With that comes de-stress. So there's not a whole lot. So it's helping them. So what you can do is help her identify. You want her to come to a place to say, I guess there's no way to solve these. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone.
All right. Hey, let's thank Kevin for being here today. So part of what brought about today was Kevin and I talking about, so you offer a longer version, a 5-hour parenting workshop, and we've talked about the possibility of hosting one of those. Tell us what would be, what would the 5-hour workshop, what would we do that we have not done today?
Yeah, great question. I forgot that we talked about that. So it's the workshop obviously has to be much smaller because the goal of the workshop is that people get very specifically something, they leave there going, I have a much better understanding of how to manage my kiddo. So we delve much more into like specific diagnoses that people can kind of get a better grasp. There's also a fair amount of just connection. I mean, you get that here if you look around. You don't have to do it right now. But if you look around, there's other people here, right? Which means you're not the only parent, right? You are just like everybody else. And that if you have a child and you care about them, or grandchildren, or nieces, or nephews, or anyone, then it matters to you. And so that's going to impact you, and that's the same for all of us. So you get that piece, and then there's very specific things from, like, we just delve more in with reflections of yourself, and then very, like, how to communicate specifically differently, and coming up with plans, and it's just, it's kind of honed to your kiddo. So we would probably put a max on how many people could attend that. Yeah.
All right, so here's what we'll do. By the way, if we haven't met, my name's Jason. I'm the lead pastor here, and so thanks for being here today. We really want to be able to help families and help our community. So if you'd like, part of today was to gauge the interest for the 5-hour parent workshop. So if you would like to know more about the workshop, just take one of these cards. They're right in the seat backs in front of you there. Just give us a little bit of enough information to contact you, whatever's the easiest way, and we're going to see if there's enough interest for it. And if there is, we'll try to get it scheduled. We'll let you know, and we'll go from there. And love to have you be a part of it, and you can get the go deeper, go more, and find some support and a plan for that. So, just fill those out, and then you can give it back to me or
and so
Kevin
you're filling
afterwards.
out the card to express your interest. So if you're not interested, it's really rude, but don't put it on there. But we haven't figured out all the details yet. We haven't figured out cost, and we haven't, other than that. So if you're interested, put it there, and then we can let you know once we come up with what that would be.
Yep, sounds good. All right, Kevin, again, thank you. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah, have a great afternoon.